Los Angeles basked in sunlight like always, but not every corner was bright. Some streets were luxury like a mask, hiding the rot underneath. And in this city where everything was a transaction, Stan Mitten moved like a shark in a glass tank. Always smiling, always sensing blood in the water. He didn't just sell homes. He sold illusions, gleaming penthouses, sugar-coated promises, contracts woven with traps for people who never imagined they'd be duped. And he was so good at it, they still thanked him after signing. They said Stan had it all. Cliffside mansion, a rotating fleet of luxury cars, and a stunning wife named Mindy who smiled flawlessly at charity galas. But what no one saw was the one thing Stan couldn't manipulate: fear. Every call from his lawyer, every headline in the business section, every curious glance from a client, all reminded him that the empire he built on deception was starting to shake. And then it collapsed. One morning, just like any other, Stan was sitting in his marble office, espresso untouched, when the door burst open. Federal agents, steel cuffs, eyes that didn't negotiate. "Stan Mitten, you're under arrest for first-degree fraud." No one said anything else. They didn't have to. The journey from leather chair to prison van took only a nod. Stan sat stiffly, no Rolex to fidget with, no assistant to call. Just one question looping through his head: how did everything fall apart so fast? First few days in holding blurred into one long, airless thought. Mindy still visited, still wore that polished calm, but this time in her eyes no pride, just something close to pity and grief. She brought up having a child. He looked away. "You want to bring a baby into this?" he asked, though he wasn't really asking her. He was asking himself. Mindy didn't answer. The visits grew shorter, fewer, and when Stan sat alone under flickering fluorescent lights, he finally understood. He was heading into a world where his tailored suits meant nothing. The night before his transfer, he sat in a dive bar off the highway. No one recognized him. His tie was loose, his eyes dull. Someone next to him mumbled, "You go in without protection. You won't make it past the third night." Stan laughed, but his hands trembled. An old man sat nearby, didn't laugh, didn't even look amused. Just watched Stan like he'd seen 100 like him. Then spoke, "You don't have to be the strongest. Just make them believe you're not afraid." Stan didn't know who he was, but the next morning, as he stepped off the bus at Central State Penitentiary, the old man was already there, cane in hand, waiting by the gates. They called him the Master. On his first day inside, Stan learned something quickly. No one cared who he used to be. No one respected designer shoes or sales records. All that mattered was a metal bunk, peeling cinderblock walls, and a cellmate with sharp eyes and wiry arms. "Stan, huh?" the man said with a half-smile. "Guys like you don't last." His name was Larry. Stan tried a polite smile, but in his mind, one truth rang louder than steel bars: either I change or I disappear. That night, he found himself thinking about the old man again. The next morning, he went looking for him. The first week in prison moved like thick fog. Slow, heavy, and impossible to escape. Stan kept his head down, adjusting to the strange symphony of clanking doors, shouted names, and unseen eyes tracking his every move. The air carried a tension he'd never known. Not the kind that closes million-dollar deals, but the kind that tells you not to turn the wrong corner at the wrong time. Larry, his cellmate, remained unpredictable. Some days he was silent, nodding at Stan with a kind of detached acceptance. Other times his words had bite, casually sharp like knives left out on the table. "You walk like a guy who thinks he's still on the outside," Larry said once, eyeing Stan's perfectly straight posture. "You'll want to lose that. Makes you a target." Stan tried to take the advice. He slouched more, talked less, but every gesture still screamed outsider. The tattoos, the hierarchies, the unwritten codes, it was another language entirely. He caught whispers in the yard, about fights over commissary items, about turf lines drawn invisibly but fiercely defended. One name kept surfacing, always spoken under breath: Big Raymond. Stan didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to, The way inmates looked around after mentioning him said everything. Fear, pure and undiluted. Even in sleep, Stan felt watched. The nights brought the low hum of tension. A radio crackling in a guard station. The soft thud of distant footsteps. The rustle of someone pacing just beyond the bars. He tried to push it down, the urge to escape, the panic that built in his chest like a slow flood. But the walls kept pressing in. He remembered the master. Their first encounter after intake had been brief but electric. The old man had studied Stan in the yard. Not with contempt, but with scrutiny. Your fear walks ahead of you, he said. You've got to put it back in your pocket. Stan didn't know how, but he listened. And every morning he showed up. The training wasn't what he expected. No push-ups or sparring matches. The master made him hold balance poses until his legs trembled. Made him walk blindfolded through the empty rec room, listening only to the sound of his own breath. Made him sit completely still, until the stillness itself became unbearable. It's not about fighting, the master said. It's about not flinching when someone tries to own you. Stan hated it at first, felt like weakness. But gradually, the tremble in his hands calmed. Buzzing in his head softened. There was power in stillness, he realized, and control in silence. In the yard, he started to notice more. Who watched who kept their back to the wall, who spoke only in questions. One afternoon, Stan sat beside a chess table, watching two older inmates play without speaking. Larry passed by and muttered, "You should learn that. Game teaches you how to survive." Stan asked, "You play?" Larry gave a dry chuckle. "No, I live it." The tension between them thawed barely over shared routines, splitting cleaning duties, exchanging glances during head counts, occasionally sharing meals in silence. But trust, that didn't come easily. One night, Larry said out of nowhere, "You think your wife's still waiting for you?" The question hit harder than a punch. Stan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, Mindy's visits had stopped. The last letter she sent was weeks ago. He read it until the paper went soft in his hands. She wrote about missing who he used to be, about not knowing who he was anymore. And then, "You always said you wanted to be someone who mattered, but now I wonder, to who?" Stan folded the letter carefully and tucked it under his mattress. Warden Gask entered Stan's story like a whisper. Casual, calm, calculated. He summoned Stan to his office one day. The guards flanked him, offering no explanation. The room was cold and clinical. Gask stood near a window, sipping dark coffee. "I've been hearing things," he said. "That you've got a voice in here, that people are listening to you." Stan didn't respond. Gask smiled, amused. "Don't worry, I like people with influence. Influence can be useful." He leaned in slightly. "You see this prison, it's old, outdated, but the land has value. And with the right moves, we could turn it into something profitable. Very profitable." Stan stared at him, confused. Was this a joke? But Gask's tone never shifted. "You help me. I make things easier for you. Fewer cell checks, better assignments, maybe even an early release. You understand?" Stan didn't answer. Not yes, not no. He just looked away. Gask shrugged, returning to his window. "Think about it, Mitten. You're good at closing deals." The days rolled forward, weighty and strange. Stan kept training, kept watching, kept learning, but tension thickened like fog before a storm. One night in the mess hall, a shiv fight broke out 2 tables over. Blood hit the floor before the screaming even started. Stan didn't flinch, and Larry noticed. "You're changing," he said, nodding slowly. "But don't let the wrong people see it yet." As fear gave way to awareness, Stan realized prison wasn't just a place. It was a test. Of strength, yes, but more of clarity, of knowing who to trust, what not to say, when to walk away, and maybe most of all, what kind of man he was going to be when he walked out. If he walked out. There was a shift in the air. It started quietly, less like a bang and more like a subtle tightening. A glance held too long, a shoulder bump that didn't come with an apology, The harmony Stan had been building, thread by fragile thread, began to fray at the edges. He noticed it first during morning lineup. Two men who'd once nodded in respect now averted their eyes. A group in the yard, once open to casual conversation, now fell silent when he passed. Even Larry, always guarded but steady, had started sleeping with his boots on. That was never a good sign. Stan felt it in his gut. Something was shifting. Something was coming. In the warden's office, Gask watched the surveillance feeds with a quiet, vicious satisfaction. His fingers drummed slowly on the desk, eyes following Stan's every move. "He's getting too comfortable," Gask murmured. "Too respected." A guard leaned in. "You want us to handle it?" Gask didn't answer right away. He reached for a pen, clicked it once, then again, then smiled. "No. Let the chaos come to him. A few nudges, some rumors, turn up the temperature, then watch what boils." The orders were subtle. Shift certain inmates to Stan's block. Rotate guards to favor the more volatile groups. Let small fires burn until they found the oxygen they needed. And just to make sure it burned the right way, Gask made another call. They called him D. No last name. No origin. Just a letter. He had once run with the Vietnamese syndicates, rumored to have gutted a man with a coffee spoon in a Bangkok prison, though no one had ever confirmed that story. He was older now, quieter, but his eyes hadn't dulled. When the guards approached him, D didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised either. "Mitten," one said, "he's got people listening. That doesn't end well for anybody." Gask's message was simple. Disrupt Stan, and in return, D would get favors, his own unit, more visiting hours, access to offshore accounts that Gask promised could still be unfrozen. D didn't respond immediately, but later that night, he stared at the ceiling in his bunk for hours, and the next day he moved two of his men into Stan's block. Stan felt the tension coil tighter. It wasn't just looks now. It was small gestures, flicked food trays, messages scrawled on the bathroom wall. One morning, his workout space in the yard had already been claimed. He didn't challenge it, but he didn't leave either. He stood there for a few seconds, staring until the man moved aside. Not out of fear, out of calculation. That was worse. Larry had grown quieter. His jokes, once sarcastic but grounding, dried up. He took longer in the shower, came back looking paler. Stan noticed him running his hands through his hair repeatedly. Not grooming, but thinking. One night, after lights out, Larry finally said it. "You're not paranoid, Stan. People are watching you. People who don't like being told how to live in here." Stan rolled onto his side. "I'm not telling anyone how to live." Larry exhaled. "No, you're not. But the problem is, they're starting to listen anyway." The shift wasn't only among inmates. Guards who once grunted in passing now lingered. They'd pat Stan down longer than necessary. One turned over his mattress without reason, then smiled as if waiting for a reaction. Stan gave none. Something was building, not just in Stan but around him. The kind of pressure that didn't release until someone snapped. Gask watched it all unfold with clinical delight. He moved through the halls like a puppeteer checking his strings. Whenever someone questioned the rising unrest, he'd wave it off. "Prisons go through phases," he'd say. "Let them work it out." But in truth, he was accelerating the fire. In private meetings, he whispered to gang leaders, offered small privileges in exchange for silence or noise. His goal wasn't to destroy Stan outright. It was to isolate him, undermine the fragile peace he'd built, and turn his influence into suspicion. In this world, Gask understood one rule better than any. Nothing spreads faster than doubt. In the chapel, the only room where the bars seemed thinner, Stan sat alone one afternoon, elbows on knees, head bowed. The master walked in quietly, his cane tapping once, twice, before he sat beside him. "You feel it, don't you?" the old man asked. Stan didn't lift his head. "Like I'm standing in the middle of a calm lake, waiting for the ripple." The master nodded. "There's no such thing as peace in here. Not for long. You built something good, and people will try to break it just to see if they can." Stan looked over. "Then what?" Just let it fall." "No," the master said, "but don't fight with fists first. Make them show themselves. The one who throws the first punch always tells you what they fear." Back in the block, Stan tried to stay the course, kept his head down, focused on daily routines, spoke when spoken to, offered help when asked, never forced it. But the cracks widened. Dee began circling, not directly but close. He would appear at the lunch table, interrupt conversations, ask inmates about their loyalty, drop phrases like, "Mitten's just another suit playing kingmaker." It worked. Doubt leaked in. Stan saw it in the way people hesitated before answering his questions, how some stopped nodding when he passed. He found graffiti outside the laundry unit. "Big Stan" or "Big Scam." That night, he sat in silence for hours, not defeated, just calculating. It came to a head during yard rotation. Stan was halfway through his third set of pull-ups when he saw the circle forming. Slowly, casually, like a snake coiling without alerting the prey. T stood at the center, arms folded, talking loud enough to gather attention but not loud enough for the guards. He says peace. I say peace is for men who already have something to lose. He turns slowly. And you, Stan, you already lost. Wife gone, reputation gone, and now you want to sell us your gospel. Stan didn't move. "I'm not here to sell anything," he said, voice steady. "But you're not here to lead. You're here to burn. This milid. Maybe, but fire clears the forest, doesn't it?" Before anyone could respond, a tray flew across the yard, then a shove. Cream. Fists collided. Stan watched it ignite, not in one flash, but in waves. He grabbed the nearest inmate trying to swing and pulled him back, shouting, "This isn't it. Don't fall for this." But his voice drowned in the roar. Larry was caught in the melee, thrown backward against the weight bench. Stan rushed toward him but slipped as two men tumbled into his path. By the time he got to Larry, a baton cracked just inches from his skull. A guard, shouting commands no one was following, swung again. Stan caught the stick in midair, locked eyes with the officer, then dropped it. But it was too late. Larry was bleeding from the scalp, barely conscious. That night, in the infirmary waiting room, Stan sat with dried blood on his shirt and questions ringing in his mind like bells no one could silence. The master arrived, his face drawn. "This is it," he said. "The moment they test who you really are." Stan whispered, "What if I fail?" The master placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then fail forward. Just don't forget why you started." The next morning, Gask strolled into the cafeteria as if nothing had happened. He smiled at Stan. "Hard week." Stan didn't answer. Gask leaned in. "I told you, influence is dangerous. Better to give it to someone who knows how to use it." Stan held his gaze, unblinking. "You think you're in control, but you're just building a dam behind a flood." Gask chuckled. "And you think you're the rain." Stan stood, slowly. "No, I'm the crack." Then he walked away. Days passed like breathing through gauze. Heavy, muffled, and wrong. Stan moved through the prison like a man underwater. The storm hadn't fully broken, but everyone could feel it. The yard was quieter, but not calm. Conversations clipped off mid-sentence. Footsteps quickened in hallways. Inmates kept their backs to walls again. The sense of possibility that Stan had once stirred now shimmered like heat haze, visible but unreachable. Larry hadn't returned to their cell. He was still in the infirmary, wrapped in silence and gauze. No visitors, no news. Stan didn't ask. He didn't need to. Something had shifted. Something had been taken. And now it was just a matter of when, not if, the dam would burst. Came on a Wednesday. Midday heat pressed against the concrete like it was trying to soften the walls. The guards were on edge, but pretending not to be. And Stan knew. He felt it in the way his chest had tightened that morning, in the way even the master looked at him with stillness instead of words. He stepped into the yard for rec hour, and the sun felt like a spotlight. The groups had already divided themselves, unofficial, unspoken, but clear. On the left, D and his circle. silent, still, watching. On the right, the men who had once trained with Stan shared food, exchanged books. Some nodded when he walked past. Others didn't. No one spoke. Even the guards were quiet. And then the door opened. Ask stepped out. He wasn't in uniform, just a charcoal gray suit. Sleeves rolled, hands behind his back. He moved like someone about to give a speech or deliver a sentence. Stan locked eyes with him. Afternoon, Gask said, voice mild. Thought I'd enjoy some fresh air. No one replied. Stan stood in the center now. No cover. No backup. Gask tilted his head. Tell me, Stan, do you still believe in peace? Stan didn't answer right away. I believe in dignity, he said. Even here. Gask smirked. And how's that working out for you? The words weren't the spark. It was the silence after, the way the guards slowly began closing in. How Dee cracked his neck and took one step forward. How a single tray in the cafeteria slammed to the floor from inside. That was the spark. The first punch came from someone Stan didn't recognize. The second came from someone he'd once played chess with. By the third, there was no turning back. The yard exploded. It wasn't chaos at first. It was coordinated, precise. Dee's men moved like parts of a machine, breaking apart clusters, targeting anyone aligned with Stan. Stan barely dodged a fist to the temple, ducked under a second, swept a third attacker with one leg. Training snapped into action, not just the fighting but the breathing, the stillness, the choice of when to move. But this wasn't self-defense anymore. This was war. He caught a glimpse of the upper catwalk. Guards watching, some laughing. One held a tear gas canister but didn't throw it. Not yet. They were waiting. Gask, still unmoved, leaned against a wall, arms crossed. Stan saw Dee coming before he heard him. The man was calm, not rushing, just walking through the chaos like it was noise beneath him. They met in the middle, fists already clenching. You should have taken the deal, Dee said. Could have played smart. Could have walked out. Stan shook his head. I'm done playing smart for men like you. Dee smiled, not kind, not cruel, just inevitable. Then lunged. Their fight wasn't elegant. It was jagged, raw. Two men forged in different fires, neither willing to bend. Dee was fast. Stan was grounded. Every move was pain and memory and instinct. Every blow was a piece of their story crashing into the others. Bijabed. Stun deflected. Dee elbowed. Stun staggered. This whipped. Stan fell, and then rose. Again, and again. Around them, the riot swelled, sirens, shouting, bones colliding with fences. But in that circle, it was personal. Then a scream. Stan turned just enough to see an inmate crumple under a baton. Another went down with a boot to the chest. And then the shot. A single crack echoed through the yard. Everyone froze. A guard, high above, stood with a rifle pointed to the sky. Smoke curled from the barrel. The yard went silent, and into that silence came Larry's voice, weak, slurred, but unmistakable. Stum. He was standing near the gate, shirt bloody, head bandaged, eyes wide and desperate. Stan pushed past the ring. Dee didn't stop him. He reached Larry just as his knees gave out. Don't. Larry wheezed. Don't let them turn this into nothing. The dam broke. Not in violence. In clarity. Stan stood up, turned to face the yard. This isn't who we are, he shouted. This is what they want. His voice cracked, but he kept going. They want us to destroy each other, to make it easy, so they can rebuild it all without us. He pointed to the guards. You see them watching. They're not coming down because they want us to burn. But we don't have to give them fire. Some listened. Some didn't. But some stepped back. Gask stepped forward. You're too late, Mitten. You can't put this back in the bottle. Stan shook his head. No, but I can choose what it becomes. Dee approached from behind. Bruised, bleeding, but calm. He looked at Gask, then at Stan, then raised his voice. We done here. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't surrender. It was a choice. One by one, the men lowered their fists. The riot faded. And in the middle of it all, Gask stood still, outnumbered, unwelcome, unmasked. Later that night, the prison was still. Stan sat outside the infirmary, watching through the glass as Larry slept. His chest rose and fell slowly, but it rose. The master sat beside him. "You didn't win," he said softly. "I know," Stan replied, "but you didn't lose." That week, things shifted. Guards were rotated. Investigators arrived. Gask was reassigned to a desk job in the city. No announcements were made, but men talked, and in the quiet corners of the prison, something new took root. Not peace, exactly, but choice, a crack in the system, a beginning. The riot ended, but it didn't disappear. It lingered in the slow way doors creaked open again, in the guarded glances exchanged during morning lineup, in the bruises that took longer to fade than anyone admitted. The yard was quieter now, not just subdued, but changed, like the men walking it were still figuring out what had survived the fire, and what hadn't. Stan woke each morning to a silence that wasn't hollow. It was watchful, measured. Something was building again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was awareness. Larry returned to their cell 5 days later. He moved slowly, like someone relearning how to carry his own body. His head was shaved now, the bandages gone, but the scar remained, pink and raw and ugly. Stan stood when he walked in, said nothing. Larry dropped his bag, sat on the bunk, looked around, then exhaled. "You redecorated," he muttered. Stan smiled, just barely. "Missed your charm." They didn't talk much that night. Didn't have to. The silence was no longer between them. It was beside them. Familiar. Forged. Warden Gask didn't return. The official word was administrative reassignment. The guards whispered darker things. Corruption, misconduct, outside pressure. But no one said it aloud. No one needed to. A new deputy warden arrived in his place. A woman. Stern, direct, unfamiliar with anyone's history. Her presence was a reset. Dan didn't seek her out. He didn't need to. His work had already begun. Started small. A reading group in the chapel. 3 men passing around a tattered novel, arguing softly about the ending. Then someone brought in a chessboard. Someone else shared their GD prep notes. Within weeks, a quiet rhythm took hold. Stan didn't lead. He invited. He listened. The same men who once laughed at his routines were now mimicking them in the yard, training not just to survive, but to focus, to steady themselves, to breathe again. One afternoon, Dee sat across from Stan in the laundry room. No garfs, no followers, just 2 chairs and the slow churn of machines. "I was wrong about you," Dee said, arms crossed. "Thought you were just another suit looking to play savior." Stan didn't look up. "You weren't wrong." Dee raised an eyebrow. "I was that. I thought I could control this place the way I used to control deals, clients, people. But that's not how this place works. And it's not how people change." Dee was quiet for a long time, then leaned back. "I'm not looking to make friends." Stan nodded. "I'm not looking to be a leader." And that was enough. They shook hands. "Not for peace. Your truth." News of the shift spread slowly beyond the walls. It started with families. Letters sent home describing study sessions, shared meals, changed men. One mother wrote back, stunned that her son, who once refused to speak to her, was now asking about forgiveness. The stories caught attention. Local community groups reached out, then advocacy organizations, then media. Mindy heard before Stan did. She had changed too. While Stan was rebuilding from within, she had been learning how to breathe outside the storm. First, she had distanced herself from the chaos, from the guilt, from him. But something pulled her back, not to save him, to understand what survival really looked like. She met with families of other inmates, learned their names, their losses, their grief, and in that grief she found purpose. She began working with a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform, attending hearings, speaking at forums, listening to stories that mirrored her own. Stories about what happens to those left behind. And then, one day, she walked through the prison gates again. Stan was in the yard, helping a younger inmate correct his posture during training. When he saw her, at first he thought he imagined it. But then her voice, soft, sure, called his name. Stan. He turned. She wore a plain blouse, hair tied back. Nothing flashy. But there was something in her stance, the stillness of it, that made the noise around them fade. He approached slowly, heart thudding. She smiled. You look different. You do too. They stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then she said, I didn't come here to relive anything. I came to see what you've become. Stan swallowed. I don't know yet. Then let's find out. They began meeting every week. Not as husband and wife. Not yet. As people in the process of rebuilding. She brought stories from outside. The growing support, the legislators taking notice, the conversations shifting. He shared stories from inside. About D, about the new men asking for books, about the moments of quiet growth he never expected to witness. Together, they imagined something bigger. A bridge between two worlds that rarely spoke. A program that wouldn't just punish but prepare. Not just reform but reconnect. They started writing it together, policies, frameworks, testimonials. A proposal not built on theory, but on lived truth. By the end of the season, the prison looked different. Still steel, still routine, but human again. Inmates who once avoided eye contact now nodded in passing. Rival groups shared garden space. The library had a waiting list. Even the guards, some of them, began to soften. And Stan, he no longer moved like a man trying to prove anything. He moved like a man finally at peace with who he could become. One morning, he sat with the master on a bench near the edge of the yard. The old man looked tired, slower, but sharp. You've done something rare, he said. You didn't just change. You let others watch you do it. Stan shook his head. I didn't lead anything. You didn't have to. You invited people to remember themselves. He paused, then added quietly, That's harder. Stan looked toward the fence, the sky beyond it. You think it'll last? He asked. The master tapped his cane lightly. That's not the question. Then what is? He turned to Stan. Will you? That night, Stan wrote his first letter in months, not to Mindy but to himself. A reminder of who he had been, and who he was still choosing to be. He tucked it beneath Flurry's chessboard, just in case. The day Stan walked out, there were no cameras, no headlanes, just a low fog clinging to the sidewalk and the soft crunch of gravel under his shoes. He stood for a long time at the gate, duffel bag in hand, eyes tracing the world beyond the razor wire. It looked both familiar and foreign, like a childhood street revisited after too many winters. Then he saw her. Mindy stood by a weathered blue sedan, arms crossed gently, eyes steady. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just waited. And that was enough. Stan took a breath, not deep, but full, then walked. The car ride was quiet. No awkward questions. No small talk. Just music. An old jazz tune humming low through the static. And the occasional glance from Mindy that said, We're still figuring this out. But we're here. They pulled into a small cottage outside the city. Nothing grand. Porch. A garden just beginning to grow again. Stan stepped out and looked around like he was counting blessings with his eyes. Home? She asked softly. He nodded. Starting to be. In the weeks that followed, they moved slowly. Mornings started with tea and silence. Afternoons drifted into long walks or work calls. Evenings were reserved for letters, not just between them but to inmates still inside. Stan had promised to stay connected, to listen, to fight for the space they'd carved out together. And they weren't alone. The community that had started behind bars was growing. Former inmates now ran outreach programs. Some taught classes in halfway homes. Others spoke at schools. D had even written a piece that went viral. A letter to his younger self, titled, Don't Let the System Define You. Mindy co-led a restorative justice initiative. She met with lawmakers, counselors, and families. She was firm in her belief. Redemption wasn't an ideal. It was a policy worth fighting for. And Stan, he became something he never expected. A mentor without a pulpit. He didn't preach. He offered time, presence, witness, and somehow that was louder than any speech. One afternoon, he stood in a gymnasium filled with students. Community event on Second Chances. The floor creaked under folding chairs. The lights flickered once, but held. He stepped up to the mic, adjusted it slowly. "My name's Stan," he said, "and I used to be a real estate agent who thought people were just leverage, numbers, ways to win." A quiet ripple passed through the room. I was wrong. He let that hang in the air, let it breathe. I ended up in prison, and for a while I thought that was the end of the story. But it wasn't. Not because I fought hard or got lucky, but because I stopped trying to be who I was before, and started learning how to be someone worth trusting. He paused again. You don't have to hit bottom to change, but if you do, you get to decide what you build from the wreckage. Later that night, back home, Stan stood on the porch holding a cup of tea. Mindy stepped beside him, wrapped in a shawl. She looked up at the stars. "I used to wonder what freedom would feel like," she said. "Not just for you, for us." Stan nodded slowly. "And now," she leaned against his shoulder, "it feels quiet, but not empty." He smiled. They stood there a long time. In the months that followed, reforms passed. Not sweeping revolutions, but steps. Funding for education programs inside. Community-led re-entry networks. Incentives for wardens to prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. The prison where Stan had once slept beneath concrete and doubt now had a name painted over the old sign. The Second Bridge Center. Inmate-run workshops filled its halls. A mural stood tall in the yard, dozens of names etched into the base. Among them, a simple signature, Big Stan. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from a teenage boy in another state. His brother had been incarcerated. He'd watched it tear their family apart, but he'd read about Stan's work. He ended the note with one line. "I thought people like you only existed in movies. Thank you for proving me wrong." Stan read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into his journal. Later, he would write back. Redemption, Stan learned, wasn't a moment. It was a practice. It showed up in choices, the quiet ones. To listen, to apologize, to show up even when it's easier to turn away. And it was never done alone. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting gold across the porch, Stan sat with Mindy and their daughter. A tiny laugh curled in her chest, fingers clutching his thumb like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. He watched her, then looked at Mindy, and for the first time in a long time said aloud, "I'm ready."